what various properties are in this water. So what plants have residual DNA here? Can you tell that there's an endangered fish species in this water? How can we use that to monitor? So DSI is used for a whole bunch of things, but unfortunately it is not currently considered under the legal definition of a genetic resource. So when DNA information is not considered a genetic resource, that means it's not subject to the same laws that it would be if it was. So you have no obligation to consult with Indigenous communities to use DSI that's openly available online about their lands, waters, and territories. You don't have to benefit share. In fact, you can use it and generate commercial benefit based on it, and you will have currently, or you would have had, no repercussions or obligations. So this is one of the biggest issues that we're currently facing or have been facing within the CBD. Within the CBD itself, there is an Indigenous sector. So Indigenous people from all over the world come together, and together we advocate for various policy and instruments that go through the convention. So I specifically do digital sequence information, but there are a whole other bunch of work programs and bits of work that come out of this convention that Manu also works on and will be sharing a bit later today. So collectively, we come together and we draft a position together, and then we advocate on behalf of all Indigenous people within this space. So we go with the mandate from our community to be there and to do our best as experts. And then together we put together our final positions and try and get the best deal possible for all Indigenous people and local communities everywhere. So my role within the IIFB, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, was to be a co-lead of the working group on DSI. So what that meant for me is that I was assisting in the drafting and the meetings and the putting together the argument, and then we're taking that to the floor at the UN, and Preston Hardison and myself shared the speaker's role. So we would speak on behalf throughout these meetings. So overall, there are a couple of really big wins that came out of COP16 that I'm sure Manu will probably speak to as well as myself, but there were also a lot of criticisms. And you will see within the Climate Change Convention at the UN that there were some criticisms here too, that these decisions that were at the COPs this year didn't quite go far enough to create meaningful change. And you could really see that in some of the ways that COP16 rolled out for the CBD. So there are a couple of really big wins that I want to talk about first. So the new program of work, and then also the permanent subsidiary body. So this creates a body for Indigenous people to be represented across the entire convention. And so instead of having a couple of Indigenous representatives at every little bit and trying to kind of get our voices heard, it provides this kind of legitimacy and backing and weight to the statements that Indigenous people make within the forum, and can provide official advice on how anything within the forum can affect Indigenous people. However, the COP ended relatively abruptly because a lot of the work didn't get finished until the last few days. And so we had COP16 for 2 weeks, and then we got to the very last few days where all of the things were meant to be signed into law. And, you know, they sit there with the gavel and they go bang, 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 and they put through all of these things and finalize them. But we only got through some of those things because by the time we got to agreement on most of the things that were going through the CBD this year, we just ran out of time. So there was a lot of criticism for that, and that included the monitoring framework and resource mobilization. And then also there were criticisms about the NBSAPs, or the National Biodiversity Action Plans, which I'm pretty sure Manu will be talking about briefly as he talks as well. So I'll leave that for him. So yes, DSI, because it doesn't fall under the definition, it's resulted in this huge lack of potential for benefit sharing agreements, for intellectual property rights, for opportunities for collaboration and consultation. And so these opportunities where researchers and First Nations, Indigenous, local communities get to work together has been missed. And that really sucks because, you know, a lot of research historically has been done through a colonial lens, in which Indigenous people have not been consulted or been part of the research or been able to see the benefits go back to their community when research is done on their lands. So this is kind of a flow-on effect of one of these problems where the status quo is a colonial status quo. And so there's a range of complexities to be navigated when we're trying to figure out how this should really look in a fair and equitable way. So within a lot of DSI that currently sits within databases, there is no record at all which country this information is from, let alone which Indigenous community. So I believe that the figure is quite low in general for provenance or location or geographical origin information, but only around 3% of DSI has a recorded Indigenous origin. So that means that for our communities and for our people all around the world, we don't know what data is held about our lands, waters, and territories. We don't know what's held, and we don't know what it's being used for. So that lack of transparency is really something that we needed to address immediately. And then also having direct relationships within DSI use is really hard, because when you're doing this kind of research, often you're comparing, say, one strand of kawakawa against every single sequence of DNA that you might have in a particular database to look for what's in common to help identify the various properties within that DNA strand. So you're using data in the aggregate. You're using multiple communities' data. You might be using multiple countries' data. And so how do you have a relationship with a community when it's not just one? You're talking about maybe you could be using samples from every single iwi in New Zealand. So how do you go about benefit sharing? How do you go back giving money to people? How do you engage with communities to do non-monetary benefit sharing, such as, giving scholarships or employing community members, or, the various other things that can come out of the relationship that's really beneficial within research. So this was exactly what has been talked about at the CBD. And the final document you will see here, if you scan it with your QR code, it just recently came out. But what they decided to do was create a multilateral mechanism. And what this is that it's a global mechanism where everyone in the world has to do the same thing. And what they have to do is if they use DSI within research that generates a commercial output, or they're commercializing something based off of DSI, then they should have to pay some money into a global fund. So that's money in. So there's a couple of key issues that we need to discuss if we're looking at a multilateral mechanism. So who has to pay for access and use of DSI, and when, at what point, when they access it, when they use it, when they do research and development on it, when the research project is complete, when they commercialize it. There's a whole bunch of options at what point you could be eligible to pay for something like this. And then if you're paying into this fund, where should it sit? Who is hosting this money? And then who's in charge of looking after the money? So how do you decide where the money goes once it's in the fund? How does that fund run? And then once money gets released out, who does it go to and where? And then how do you review this mechanism going forward? So there's a huge bunch of issues to be discussed within the mechanism, and this is where we rolled out. So all users of DSI information are encouraged to share benefits in the form of non-monetary benefit sharing. So non-monetary benefit sharing can be a range of things, but what's important is that the benefit sharing should support the self-identified needs of Indigenous peoples and local communities, including women and youth. So if you're working with data from a community and they say, we really need jobs, or they say we have some students that need scholarships, then that's their self-identified needs, and you should be supporting what they need as a community. Perhaps they need money to go to their kura. Perhaps they need more sports gear for their tamariki. Who knows? The community can say, this is what we need. If you want to work with us, then you need to be able to meet our needs. And that is baseline. Everyone who uses DSI is obliged to share non-monetary benefits. And then if you have to pay into the fund, this is only done for sectors specifically that directly or indirectly benefit from the use of DSI. So this could be pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and various kind of things here where you're doing genetic research or DSI research that goes into creating a final product. And so the company or the entity that uses the DSI has to contribute a portion of their profits or revenue. And they can choose which one it is at the moment. You don't have to do profits or revenue, but if you're doing profits, you have to pay 1% of your profits or 0.1% of revenue. And that's just kind of an indicative rate for now, which will be reviewed over time. And the exceptions to who should have to pay are public databases, academics, and public research institutions. And this is because they're considered to not have the same kind of commercial interests as a commercial entity might have when using this information. However, they can still pay if they want to. And the fund that this goes into is now called the Cali Fund because COP16 was held in Cali, Colombia. Oh, we're going to go to the next slide. Yes. Okay, so next, money out. So originally, when we started talking about how benefit sharing should occur, we had always said that the priority and the majority recipient of funds from the Cali Fund should be Indigenous people and local communities. And this is because we as Indigenous people conserve and steward the vast majority of the world's biodiversity. And so that needs to be recognized. And so throughout the negotiations, we briefly got lowballed a bit and someone said, oh, well, how about we only give 30% to Indigenous communities from the fund? And from there, we were able to reverse that up to 80% of the fund. And then the final figure that got landed on as agreed by the parties to the CBD was that a majority should go. And so that means at least 50% of the funds that are generated from this go back to communities. And this will be done on a project basis. So Indigenous communities that are doing biodiversity conservation projects back home can apply for a grant or a fund from this fund and then get supported to do the work that they're wanting to do. And so it helps to kind of fulfill those self-identified needs of Indigenous communities. One of the biggest drawbacks within this, however, is that we really advocated for direct access to funds. So money to go straight from this fund, straight to the community. However, that unfortunately did not fly. For a lot of countries, they felt like it was skipping over their sovereignty as governments. And so what the final agreement was that either money goes to the government, which then gives it to Indigenous people and local communities in their country, or if the country is okay with it, it can go directly to an institution that an Indigenous community chooses for themselves. How that works in New Zealand is that we currently believe under the current wording that a iwi trust board would fulfill this criteria as an institution to receive funds. For us in New Zealand, that makes it a bit easier, but for other communities that don't have trusts or representative bodies, this can be really confusing for them. And so they might need to partner with a research institution, for example, to receive this fund. And so that can get quite complicated. So there is a big win in the sense that the majority of the funds is going to us, but the stipulations behind it are a bit harder. Now, while we've been talking about DSI, there's also the databases that hold this DSI and what does the fund mean for them? So because we're looking at a Wild West where people have not had any rules around the use of their DSI, they now have to look at what kind of rules should we have in place. So now databases have a set of obligations that are, first of all, to make information about benefit sharing for the multilateral fund available. So all users can see that they might have obligations. When they're putting data into a database, they have to affirm that there were no restrictions on sharing this information. So yes, we had the right to do the sequencing, and yes, we have the permission to put this in a database. So you have to verify that there was consent. And then also for those submitting data into it, they have to show that they've complied with their benefit sharing obligations. So you cannot sequence data of genetic resources necessarily in the first place without the consent of the community. That's under Nagoya. It's the right of first digitization. So if something's being sequenced for the first time, the community has to consent to it. Also, and this is the part that I'm really excited about, is you have to record provenance information. So not only should you share which country the DSI comes from, but you should also indicate the original Indigenous territory or the origins of the traditional knowledge that you're using, or you could use local context notices and labels. So there's a huge range, but basically all submitters of DSI have to start acknowledging the Indigenous origins of the DSI. And then also on the other side of things, there's a set of guidelines that databases are now encouraged to follow. So first is fair, care, and trust. I won't go too deep into fair and care, but those are two really big ones that we advocated for really hard out. Specifically care. FAIR is already used within BB&J and a couple of other places, but CARE has never been put in an international instrument before. And CARE, the acronym stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And these 4 principles apply specifically for Indigenous rights within data. So they're now bound to follow these particular 4 guidelines, which is great. And I recommend you do a bit more research on them because they all have a lot to say about Indigenous data and data sovereignty and the way that we interact, share, and store data. We're nearly at the end, but I just wanted to talk a little more about why biocultural metadata is important. So biocultural metadata is many things. It could be local context, labels and notices. It could just be listing the origin of the Indigenous community that the DSI is from, or it could be indicating all sorts of different things. So there's a range of what biocultural metadata could be, but it recognizes our connection as Indigenous peoples to the land and our connection to our sustainable and conservative use of biodiversity throughout history. And it respects our need to be ongoingly connected to the data held about our lands, waters, and territories. It helps to operationalize FAIR and CARE, which these databases are now recommended to be following. And then also provenance information is being increasingly required in international law. So you'll see in the WIPO Treaty that they also have to disclose the origins of traditional knowledge if you're applying for a patent that uses it. So say, for example, you're doing research on kawakawa, and then you're applying for a patent on a way of extracting that anti-inflammatory property. Then you would have to say within the patent the particular communities that the traditional knowledge for kawakawa comes from. And then this also allows for the use of local contexts. So there's a couple of other things here. So it's connection to data, visibility of information, Indigenous-led research. When we as Indigenous people are able to locate the data held about our lands, waters, and territories, it means that we can use it ourselves. And it empowers us to do our own research and empowers us to help make decisions about how we conserve the biodiversity on our territories better. It also helps prevent biopiracy because there is a new level of transparency that they are obliged to be following. It helps us to be able to give our free, prior, and informed consent because you have to show that there was consent or that you were following all the right processes in order to have this information in the first place. So there's a whole bunch of reasons that this is really important, and it's not purely connected to benefit sharing itself. Benefit sharing, important, yes, but we know as Indigenous people that there is a huge amount of power in data. And for us to be able to have a say in what data is collected on our lands, waters, and territories, how it's used, and the kind of stories it tells about us as people. So lastly, to finish off, there's a couple of really interesting resources that I'd really like to recommend. First of all, He Tohu Arahi is the guidelines that we at Te Kotahi put out earlier this year. And this is a really interesting resource because it takes, it's a first step for communities to use when they're looking at developing research relationships with collaborators. And so it talks about the kind of questions you could be asking of a potential research partner, or what kind of things within a contract you should be looking at covering. So your IP and your data and all of the plans that you need to put in place for things like dispute resolution, or who owns copyright, or how are you going to recognize the Indigenous community as part of the research. So I really recommend that one. I recommend looking into FAIR and CARE a bit more. And there's a huge amount of resources out there about Indigenous data sovereignty that feed into this. But yeah, for the next 2 years, we're going to be reviewing the multilateral mechanism and seeing if it works. And for now, we're just kind of waiting for that to start. So it's been a really interesting couple of years working towards this. And I've been very, very, very lucky to be having the privilege to be at the UN and speaking on behalf of Māori and to be working with such brilliant Indigenous people from all around the world. It's been really inspiring and really special, especially as an early career researcher. So yeah, feeling very thankful and really glad that Manu came along as well. And I look forward to hearing his take on COP16. So kia ora, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Katie Lee. I will share my screen. And yeah, it was my first COP and so I thought I would just sort of, for those that haven't been to one, provide a bit of a sort of, this is how it rolls and what happens at these things. So what the United Nations, we've got, remember the Rio Summit in the early 90s, came up with the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is this global agreement on how we're going to save biodiversity. New Zealand's signatory to that. And the last COP that Katie Lee went to in Montreal produced this global biodiversity framework, which is kind of the how do we operationalize this convention that's got a whole lot of really high level things, but it's taken 20, 30 years to start implementing it with a bit more focus. And the COP stands for something of parties.
Conference of the Parties.
Conference of the Parties. And so this is the 16th meeting of those, and the parties are those governments, the state parties that have signed up to the agreement. So like the USA is not a signatory to the CBD, so they still turn up, but they don't get as much of a say as others. And so yeah, it was in Cali, which is a city of 5 million people in Colombia, on the Pacific, towards the Pacific coast. And basically everybody goes there, so governments, NGOs, Indigenous peoples, big business contingent, lobbyists from corporate sector, young people, academics, and there's room for the public as well. And they split it into the green zone, which is the more public part of the event, similar to the COP for climate. And then the blue zone is where you need to have registered and be part of an accredited organisation. So that could be an NGO or it could be a government delegation. And so, yeah, 700,000 people went to the Green Zone event. So there's a whole lot of meetings and presentations and parties and all sorts in the Green Zone. I got to go to one Green Zone event that I was speaking at, and otherwise I didn't get to the Green Zone. That was held quite a way away from the Blue Zone. And the Blue Zone had 23,000 people registered to attend that, which was in a big convention. It's not quite a centre, sort of a big facility that had a few big rooms, but then had a whole lot of pavilions outdoors that a lot of the negotiations and side events happened in. 1,500 businesses, over 1,000 journalists. We have sort of, as Katie Lee said, the IIFB, which is the Indigenous Peoples Caucus for CBD, and there are over 300 Indigenous peoples in that group within the Blue Zone. And yeah, a whole heap of diplomats and things. And so, yeah, more of the activisty stuff happens in the Green Zone, tends to be, though there were a few protests and things in the Blue Zone. There was a lot of security around the Blue Zone. We had to walk a long way every morning to get in and go through security checks. And it was a bit out of town, whereas the Green Zone was right in the CBD of Cali. And you have these things called side events, which are presentations. Anyone can host a side event if you've registered it, and you basically have a kaupapa that you want to talk about, and you might get a panel of speakers to come and listen. And this was the one that I was at in the Green Zone with myself and an Indigenous activist from Colombia that was organised by university. And so a lot of public things that you don't have to register for, and some that you do within the Green Zone. In the Blue Zone, everybody has to be accredited, and it also has side events with presentations and discussions where really interesting stuff happens, but then it also hosts the really intense formal negotiations that Katie Lee was talking about in terms of the DSI mechanisms and the wording of the agreements. The New Zealand delegation had 5 members, and so Foreign Affairs had a couple of people, DOC had 1 representative, the EPA had somebody there with a focus mostly on genetic engineering rules and biosecurity, and MPI was there for biosecurity, as well as stuff like oceans, marine policy, and wildlife protection, I think, or they sort of shared it between themselves. So it was a lot for those 5 individuals to cover, way too much. My understanding is the delegation had been 10 people and it got cut back to 5. And yeah, it was just a big stretch for those officials to get across all of the issues, which I'll share in a sec. There are also a bunch of other people from Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is a few of us in the photo, along with the officials. This is Maya from DOC. Gillian was the head of the delegation from MFAT. Tim's from EPA, and Molly from MPI. Then the rest of us are hangers-on. This is a list of those that we knew about, and we had a little chat group to catch up with each other, but really didn't see each other much during the event. Those in bold were the Māori there, which was cool. And then 3 of us participated in the Indigenous Caucus, which met every morning, and that's this IIFB, which is an NGO, sort of a permanent group that tries to progress Indigenous people's issues between the COPs, and then has quite a good organising and engagement role during the event. This is Katie Lee with some of the other members of the caucus at a press conference, and so there's heaps of press conferences every day, and the IIFB got to present quite a few of the issues from our perspective to the media and to the other delegations through those processes. And then there were a few IIFB side events that were hosted as well that highlighted the issues. This is sort of the format. This is one of the small rooms. There's a bigger room than this one. This was the second biggest one, but this is sort of, they call it plenary. So everybody's there with their country name tag. They're all up the front there. There's a whole row for Indigenous peoples in the middle here somewhere, and then NGOs and other observers at the back. And then over in the left there are translation interpreters. So you get 6 official UN languages to be able to hear what's going on, and the official sort of chair and secretariat sit up the front and manage the meetings. And then you have these more sort of like breakout groups where the negotiations happen in more detail, and they'll be on a particular topic. And in this case, sitting around the table are the country delegations. And over in the far corner here is Katie Lee and one other member of the IIFB caucus. This might have been in the DSI discussions. And all of these people are government officials. A few of them will be NGOs, and a few of them will be business lobbyists who are interested in what the impacts are going to be of this DSI rule or the gene editing discussions and so on. So they're there to keep tabs on things and keep in touch with their counterparts back at home to keep them appraised. And these are quite confidential meetings. There's no, not supposed to be any photos taken, and certainly not videos and things. So that's how, and then there's smaller groups as well. This is within the Indigenous Caucus. We met every morning for an hour and looked at the agenda for the day, looked at our positions on the issues. Because the negotiations are dynamic, and every day there's changes, and we've got to react and respond and decide where to go. And so these are opportunities to debate the position of the IIFB. And we start with karakia, or a ceremony at the start of each meeting, and then get into it. And often we'll also host representatives from different governments or other NGOs come and speak. And so that's was sort of where we wānanga the kaupapa and come up with positions if we can. And then there's just smaller groups. So this was in a discussion with the delegation from Norway, where we were, and this was the DSI team. So within each of the sort of top 3 or 4 kaupapa for IIFB, there's a hardcore group of experts like Katie Lee, and the others here. We were in the room with Norway, who were our allies on this particular issue, and we're pushing hard for 100% of the the benefits from DSI to flow to Indigenous peoples, and we were talking to them about how we were going to progress that. There's a couple of academics there from the UK who have been really helpful in doing a lot of the good analysis that we've been able to utilise in those negotiations. So we've got those allies around the world that help with the process. And so that's where some of you get to talk Turkey and work on strategy with friendly governments. And even when there's groups that are opposed, it's good to meet with them and deliberate on where those points of difference are to see if some agreement can be made, because everybody's trying to get to consensus by the deadline. And that's what happened with DSI, and it happened with one of the other major issues for Indigenous peoples, which was good, but there were others that just didn't get agreement, and they'll have to wait for another 2 years for more discussions in between, and then at the next COP number 17 they'll get aired again. So these were the kind of core issues that the delegations were debating. I've put what I think are the logos of New Zealand government agencies responsible for those areas. Unfortunately, Te Puni Kōkiri wasn't allowed to attend. Likewise, you can see biodiversity and health probably should have had someone from Ministry of Health there as well. And so, there was a lot, as I say, for those 5 officials from the 4 government agencies to get across all of these. They're all in those meetings, all going through for long, long hours every day, debating the details of where the comma goes, where the and should or shouldn't go, what wording should and shouldn't be within the final text. And those ones in bolded were the ones that the Indigenous caucus were most interested in. But very diverse bunch of issues in the negotiations. This was the other big one for IIFB, the Article 8J, which comes from the convention, and it talks there on the left about the need to support and protect the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, given our role in kaitiakitanga essentially, and our relationship with Te Taiao and the natural environment. And so there's been long discussions about how to implement this part of the convention. There's been work programs, and there's a new one that was on the cards. This is the headlines, and under each of these there's a heap of tasks. But these are the kind of issues that this group, which was set up as a working group in the early days, the first group met in 2000. And so they've been meeting for 24 years as this kind of ad hoc and semi-formal but not really recognised group with no security or certainty. And the big push in this COP was from the IIFB to get the group set up as a permanent body within the CBD structure, so that Indigenous peoples have a permanent place there and are supported to properly participate, rather than being an adjunct sort of added on to the main bodies within the CBD. And on the right, you can see people celebrating. On the left, our protest, where it looked like we might not get it the day before, as the deliberations were coming to an end, but late into the night, that there was a breakthrough, and the parties agreed to establish this permanent body. Some of the other key topics: biodiversity financing was a big topic, and lots of the side events and some of the main deliberations was how are we going to fund this stuff. There's 20 billion a year that was being committed, but not really, and trying to work out how to get more finance, a bit like with the COP for climate in recent weeks. Not enough funds are flowing to address the issues that are before us as a planet. So that was a big one. As Katie Lee said, the MBSAPs, these national strategies and action plans for biodiversity, was a big thing. Very few countries have submitted them. They have to submit their implementation plans. New Zealand still to submit ours. and they have these sort of monitoring periods where they have deadlines where they're supposed to have put stuff in, and some of them are well overdue. Like we're only a little bit overdue, but some countries have missed 3 or 4 of those milestones, and many of them really struggle. They just don't have the resources, particularly in developing countries, to organise themselves. The need is huge, and the available resources are really small. But countries like New Zealand, I'd say, don't have an excuse other than it hasn't been a priority for successive governments. And so we are yet to get onto that, and DOC has a fairly short time frame in the new year to organise. They haven't even done proper consultation yet, so the clock's ticking on that. And then rights of nature was touched on, but I'd have thought it was going to have a higher prominence than it did. There were a few NGOs really pushing for it, but overall it wasn't a major part of the agenda, and I suspect it will become increasingly part of the program in future CBD discussions. So while we were there, it was agreed that the next one would be in Armenia. It had to be one of a few countries. They sort of move it around the world each time, every 2 years. And it was out of Armenia and Azerbaijan just hosted the climate COP. And there's a few human rights issues in not many of these countries, as we know. Anyway, Armenia got it was fairly close actually, but they got the pick. And I guess this slide's just saying there's a bunch of work we should be all getting on with between now and then, so that both central government are organised and engaging and prepared and transparent about the positions that they're taking on our behalf as citizens, but also as Māori, we need to be better organised so that it's not ad hoc people like myself and Katie Lee just rocking up, doing our best, but there's support and resourcing and accountability and all of the transparency around the positions being taken and getting those frameworks flowing back and making sure that we appreciate and understand the impacts that these things have at an international level into the domestic situation. With biodiversity is a bit different to climate commitments and some of the other conventions where there's less sticks, I suppose, to enforce those commitments. But if you're going to be part of CBD, you're committing to doing a bunch of stuff. And again, there's not a lot of education and awareness in the general public about what we should and could be doing, both domestically and also supporting our neighbours in the Pacific and around the world to address the issues. Katie Lee and I both went as representatives of the Aotearoa Indigenous Rights Trust, which it was set up in the 1990s. People like Tracy Whare and Claire Charters and Maria Baj, Dale Takitimu, Aroha Mead, Moana Jackson, all been active with that trust, and it's really there to facilitate this kind of engagement. So if others are interested, reach out, and there's a website there. I think that is the end of my presentation, so we're both available for questions or comments now. 10 minutes to go.
Ngā mihi ki a kōrua. Yes, as Manu said, please do throw some questions into the chat or just unmute yourself and ask away. Let's just see who's got the cameras going. Bruce, you're looking, Bruce and Krista and Silua are all sitting there. Have any of you got any questions you'd like to ask?
Kia ora, kōrua. Thanks very much for the talk. It was cool to hear about how COP16 went and just get a feel for how it happens on the ground. When the announcement came out about the digital sequence decision, I spoke to some of the scientists at Plant Food where I work just about, well, how's that going to be perceived by scientists who work in that sort of genomic digital sequence space. And one of the comments I heard coming back, which I thought was interesting, was just that tension around open source, and that I guess you alluded to it, Katie, around systematic research that's comparing across lots of sequence from different origins. And I guess the scientific community's moved towards this open source philosophy. So do you have any thoughts about how we might manage or counter that kind of perception that's sort of become ingrained?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things that got discussed during the process heading to the final DSI discussion was that some people felt very strongly about maintaining open science and not hindering kind of this open science format for research. And again, like you say, a lot of DSI use is in the aggregate form. And so I think there was this concern that paying for access to DSI would be counter to open science. And so, if you break down the DSI journey, one of the first few steps within the research is access. And then so that access, we didn't want to incur the payment for the mechanism there, because then it goes against open science. So was it then use? So say you download a particular data set and use that to do your aggregate comparisons or things like that, should you do it then? And again, they felt that this was against open science, and then also it didn't capture the kind of non-commercial use. So for academia especially, or any kind of non-commercial research using DSI, they didn't want them to have to pay. So what's next down the value chain is commercialization. So when you first start commercializing, should payment be done then? They felt that would be unfair for small businesses and things like that. So that's why we've ended up at this. If your company or your entity generates a profit from using DSI and you're in a specific sector, then you are eligible to voluntarily put money into the fund. So that's the other keyword, is the fact that it's voluntary. So you've got this value chain that right at the end, you're depositing voluntarily money into this fund. And it's a very specific threshold where if you make over a certain amount, then you might be eligible to pay a bit more. Well, that was the original kind of tiered system that they were going to do. But now it's just kind of like a flat 1% or 0.1% profit revenue, whatever. So that's kind of what they've done to kind of counter this worry about open science. And so while it kind of does dilute who might be eligible to pay into the fund, it does kind of assuage that need to keep science open that is really important for a lot of scientists. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
It does. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Go for it, Rebecca. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Kia ora. Kia ora koutou mō o kupu, whakahirahira, tēnei kaupapa. This is a new area for me, but I'm really interested to hear more about where the data is held and how it's held, because I'm sensing a tension between the communities that the data comes from and where that data sits and who has control over it. So are you able to elaborate on that for me?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your question. That's a good one. So this multilateral mechanism specifically is for public open source databases. So that's databases such as GBIF, so the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So private databases, such as those held by companies or ones that aren't open to the public, this doesn't apply to them. And then also, if you say are an Indigenous repository specifically, such as the Native Biodata Consortium, it's unclear whether they're considered public or private at the moment. I'm pretty sure because they're not open access that they would be considered private, so they also don't apply. So there's a whole bunch of range, right? So there's the public databases that have this information and it's free and open access, which is where the benefit sharing is going to be coming from. And then you've got private, and then you've got Indigenous, which are kind of their own little realm. So we'll park those and we'll go back to the public one. So one of the biggest problems within public databases is that, within DSI, is that because they don't record where the information is from, it's really hard for our communities to know what information on those databases actually pertains to their lands, waters, and territories. And so because you don't know whose land it is or who has a relationship with this data set or this particular sequence, it's really hard for us as Indigenous peoples to have a say or to have a relationship or to use this data, which is one of the things that we've been trying to rectify going forward. So that's where that whole provenance information part really feeds into it. So there's a couple of bits in there. So there's hopefully with the new regulation coming in that this data will be enhanced over time and that we as Indigenous people can see what is already out there. And then also being mindful when research is done with collaborators that we have really strong conversations about where that data goes. And then also when you're looking at private databases or Indigenous repositories, looking at whether it's not necessarily the fact that it's open access that is always the problem for communities. For some communities, open access doesn't bother them. It's more the fact that they don't have a say over who can and can't use the data or whether they can give their free, prior, and informed consent for research. So it varies from community to community what their priorities are in relation to finding data. But this is one of the biggest key issues is that with this benefit sharing arrangement, if a public database suddenly just decides to go private because they don't want to be eligible to pay into this mechanism anymore, or there's a whole bunch of issues to really pick out as we go along. And does that answer your question, or did you have any follow-ups on that?
I think it does. And I guess the takeaway is that control is not sitting with Indigenous people.
Exactly.
So that's the point, I guess, to balance that back out and share some of the good things that come from it.
Yes, and one of the really important things with the guidelines that they now are recommended to adhere to is that one of them is care, right? And under care, the A in care stands for authority to control. So most public databases are now obliged to consider how Indigenous communities have authority over their data and get to have a say. So what we're really hoping is that gets picked up over the next few years, because it's exactly what you say, like the ability to even have a say or to be at the table is like one of the first problems, not to mention all the things that you get down the track when you're having these conversations. Yeah. Manu, did you have anything to add on that?
Maybe just to say that private doesn't necessarily equal bad either. There's some companies that presented at COP and others that we're aware of that have negotiated that access and sharing under terms that are agreeable to the kaitiaki, essentially. Though some companies, it depends, because the way the system works is that it's like national bodies, as in state parties, that tend to be responsible and often have the relationship with companies, and they then facilitate access to the legitimate rights holders within their jurisdiction. And so you've still got that mediation of the state body deciding on who's legitimate and who's not. But my point was, in some cases, and it's rare at this stage, I think, but there are examples where communities have had the chance for full, prior and informed consent to share what they want to, and many of those companies don't make the access exclusive to themselves. They, and the part of the terms that the communities agree on is that that's not just for that company, but the companies provided benefits to the communities that have those rights in exchange for access to the information, and trying to do that in an ethical way. And I was a bit sceptical about some of it, but was reassured by the end of my conversations with one or two that it didn't sound as bad as I thought it might be, without seeing all of the details. And some of these companies are coming to Aotearoa as well. Met with a lawyer who's working with a company that has DSI from a national park here, and another company working with an iwi to do some exploration in the Aroha. So it's already underway, and the challenge and the opportunity is to get our people up to speed with good terms and what constitutes a good agreement and a fair agreement, and what provisions within those agreements are going to protect the stuff that we want protected and exclude the things we want excluded. So a lot of work to be done.
Thank you, ngā mihi.
Is there somebody else who one more question? There's one in the chat here from Krista who's had to duck away, but I was wondering if you two could read that one about infrastructure and online resources about the Kali Fund administrators.
Yeah, so the Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office.
There's the link. Yep.
Yeah, oh, there you go. Perfect.
Yep.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Manu.
Manu.
That would probably be the best resource to go to, because there was a couple of different fund hosts, and there was a couple of different problems with each host. And one of the biggest problems that we were finding for a lot of parties was that they wanted to make sure that funds could go to developed and developing countries. And there were some hosts that only did one or the other, and that had strict rules in place. So the Multi-Partner Trust Fund is currently the host, but there is the general consensus that if the host doesn't work out, that they will develop a different host themselves. So that's kind of the temporary trial. Yeah, would you agree with that?
Yeah, there are certainly aspirations from the IIFB that we end up with our own fund that we manage, or Indigenous peoples are in control of, rather than a UN thing. But nobody knows quite how big or small the fund is going to be, and this trust fund is set up for this kind of stuff. They host a bunch of other funds, and as Katie Lee said, there were pros and cons of a bunch of things, a bunch of options we looked at, including some of the big First Nations funds in North America as potential hosts. But this was where it landed. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Right, we've gone over time a little, but that's perfectly fine because I love having questions. But thank you. Ngā mihi kia korua. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for your support over the year, both of you, and also thanks to everyone who's been attending our Whāki webinars. We've been really encouraged by some support and feedback we've been getting. So to finish the session off today, let's have a karakia whakamutunga, and a big thank you again to everyone. Me noi tātou. Unuhia, unuhuria, unuhia I te urutapu nui, kia wātea, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua, I te ara takatū. Ko I rā e rongo, whakairea ake ki runga, kia wātea, ai rā, kua wātea, hau pai mārere. Thanks everyone, thanks for coming along, and we'll see you in the new year. Don't forget Tint Summit if you want to come, we'd love to see you.